A secret control system, composed of 6 steps, had allegedly trapped young artists for years within a mechanism of power that no one dared to mention. The assertion first appeared as an isolated whisper, a loose piece in a puzzle that seemed impossible to assemble. However, that murmur quickly transformed into a torrent of contradictory versions when the names of various implicated individuals began to circulate, occupying headlines and fueling endless discussions on social media and specialized forums. Each pointed-out figure reacted with surprising speed, whether to deny any participation or to distance themselves from the facts. All except one. The absence of a response from Xin Qi, the renowned president of an influential entertainment company, generated an interpretive void that the public filled with hypotheses of all kinds. His silence not only amplified collective curiosity, but also awakened a series of inevitable questions regarding the real scope of his power and the position he occupied within an industry accustomed to handling sensitive information behind dense curtains that are difficult to penetrate. Around him, episodes from the past began to resurface, some documented, others wrapped in the ambiguity of anonymous sources, but all converging on the construction of a figure whose influence seemed to extend beyond the artistic realm. In parallel, the case of Yu Menglong, a young performer who had gained notoriety in television contests, reappeared with unexpected intensity. His career, marked by brief ascents and prolonged pauses, suddenly became the narrative axis of multiple accounts seeking to explain not only his trajectory, but also the complex professional relationship he maintained with the company directed by Xin Qi. The versions revealed in different media outlets configured a panorama where demanding contracts, internal pressures, and strategic decisions intertwined, generating a climate in which the thin line between opportunity and subordination acquired a disturbing prominence. In this context, the entertainment industry was once again placed under an implacable magnifying glass. The dynamic between managers, investors, and fame aspirants exposed the fragility of those who depend on rigid structures to sustain a career. At the same time, the massive dissemination of unverified testimonies opened a debate on the limits of digital information, the speed with which public opinion is formed, and the difficulty of distinguishing between evidence, interpretation, and speculation. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damages, to see how the world of entertainment functions and how an icon is redefined. The story that follows does not pretend to issue definitive judgments, but to explore the gray spaces that emerge when power, fame, and silence converge. It is in those spaces where motivations, conflicts, and decisions are usually hidden, elements that over time end up shaping collective perception. The public investigation surrounding this case began in a fragmented manner, almost like an echo repeating without certainty. The first mentions offered nothing more than unconnected scraps, but as the days passed, those scraps took shape, outlining a scenario where media pressure and strategic silences intertwined in a way that was difficult to ignore. Several personalities linked to the entertainment world responded quickly, clarifying their positions or denying any relationship with the accusations that were emerging. However, the figure of Xin Qi continued to be an absolute exception. His silence occupied a central place in the discussion, generating an interpretive void that seemed to further widen the existing tension. While others explained or denied, the absence of a response from Xin Qi began to be interpreted as a narrative component in itself. The entertainment industry, accustomed to timely declarations and public maneuvers destined to protect reputations, found itself facing an unusual reaction that intensified the intrigue. This silence was not limited to the omission of statements, but became a phenomenon pointed out by analysts and followers who observed how the lack of official pronouncements opened the door to divergent interpretations. For some, the absence of comments evidenced prudence. For others, it fueled suspicion regarding the internal dynamics of the company he led. The case of Yu Menglong, whose trajectory had experienced moments of exposure and periods of withdrawal, returned to the scene precisely amidst this climate of uncertainty. his figure reappeared not as a simple memory of the past, but as a key element in the reconstruction of the general panorama. Some observers highlighted the vulnerability that emerging artists face within complex contracting systems, where the search for opportunities can imply difficult concessions or a profound dependence on rigid hierarchical structures. In that sense, the relationship between Yu and the company managed by Xin Qi emerged again as a point of analysis, not for categorical judgments, but for the multiple interpretations that allow for a better understanding of the tensions derived from the power imbalance. The artistic environment in which both operated was not alien to intense competition or the impossible expectations that are usually imposed on those seeking to consolidate themselves in a saturated market. Representation firms handle strict contracts, training programs, promotional commitments, and demanding schedules that can generate constant tensions. The thin line between opportunity and pressure becomes especially delicate when decisions are made under the influence of commercial interests, personal aspirations, and complex family dynamics. This context created the conditions for different versions of the facts to find fertile ground, exposing the challenges of an industry in which reputation is a fundamental asset. The discrepancies between the accounts that subsequently arose underscored the difficulty of interpreting information without falling into premature conclusions. On several occasions, testimonies emerged from anonymous sources, whose lack of verification made it difficult to establish a definitive sequence of events. Social networks, by amplifying every detail, contributed to molding public perceptions in real time, giving rise to a narrative tension that oscillated between empathy toward the artists and questioning toward the structures that regulate their careers. In the midst of this debate, the figure of Xin Qi continued to be absent, which granted even more relevance to interpretations based on his silence. This scenario led to diverse questions related to the possible motives behind the lack of declarations. Was it a containment strategy? Did internal legal advisory processes exist? Or was it simply sought to avoid adding complexity to a case already exposed to public opinion? Analysts specializing in crisis management pointed out that, on occasions, the absence of pronouncements can respond to an attempt to avoid mistaken interpretations while information is gathered. However, the prolonged lack of clarity generated a narrative space that the public filled with hypotheses, combining facts, perceptions, and emotions. The case of Yu Menglong also contributed to configuring this analytical prism. Mentions regarding the difficulties he had allegedly faced in his career generated new questions about the type of pressures experienced by young talents. The transition from initial media exposure to professional consolidation often implies a complex adaptation process where relationships with representatives, producers, and executives acquire a determining relevance. In that framework, any tension or contradiction can be amplified until it becomes a key piece in the interpretive puzzle. The sum of all these elements fueled a growing sensation of uncertainty. The public began to ask themselves how these fragments fit within a broader narrative. Conversations shifted from immediate questions toward reflections regarding the fragility of artistic representation systems and the loss of autonomy that some performers might experience within firmly established corporate structures. Media pressure intensified these perceptions, generating an environment in which every detail acquired greater significance than it initially seemed to contain. As contradictory versions and testimonies difficult to verify accumulated, a point emerged where the story ceased to focus solely on individual figures. It became a reflection of the dilemmas faced by those who depend on powerful structures to advance their careers. In that shift of focus, Xin Qi's continued silence acquired a symbolic dimension that still generates debate today. The audience, faced with this complexity, remained in a state of constant expectation, trying to understand which elements constituted the real basis of the conflict and which formed part of the void that no one had yet managed to explain. What do you think about this? Comment amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The magnitude that this case reached in the subsequent weeks was not the product of a concrete declaration, but of the cumulative effect of small revelations that, one after another, provoked an immediate reaction in the media ecosystem. The speed with which information circulated transformed what initially seemed like a matter circumscribed to a business figure into a phenomenon affecting the entire entertainment sector. Each post, each comment, and each new testimony generated an impact that multiplied as the audience sought to understand how a succession of rumors could acquire such force in so little time. Xin Qi's prolonged silence continued to be one of the most commented upon elements, since in the midst of a scenario saturated with voices and versions, his absence became a point of contrast impossible to ignore. Public reaction was divided from the very first moment. One sector interpreted the appearance of anonymous testimonies, unverified accounts, and ancient mentions as sufficient indications to consider that a more complex background existed behind the story. For those who adopted this position, the sequence of information coincided with known phenomena within highly competitive industries, where internal dynamics can include pressures, abrupt strategic decisions, and controversial management. The figure of Yu Menglong, which emerged constantly in conversations, was seen by this group as the symbol of a supposed structural tension that would affect numerous artists. The emotional resonance of the case accentuated this approach, giving the impression that the scattered pieces could form a coherent story that had not yet been fully understood. However, another sector of the public maintained a different stance, highlighting the importance of distinguishing between what could be confirmed and what belonged to the realm of speculation. This group insisted on the fact that the abundance of information did not necessarily equate to clarity. They also pointed out that the digital environment, by amplifying every fragment, tends to generate narratives that can diverge considerably from provable facts. For them, the absence of an official declaration by Xin Qi did not constitute evidence, but a variable that had to be interpreted within internal processes that usually require legal advice and careful communication. From this perspective, the debate should not focus on premature conclusions, but on the need for prudence in the face of a cluster of data impossible to verify completely. The intensity with which the public exchange developed began to affect the daily functioning of the industry. Some planned collaborations were delayed, while certain projects were temporarily reevaluated, not necessarily due to a direct relationship with the facts, but because the general climate provoked uncertainty. Representation agencies, aware of the impact that public perception can have on their talents, initiated internal reviews destined to evaluate possible indirect effects on their management. These reactions revealed the extent to which collective opinion can influence a sector that depends on the stability of its image as much as on its creative capacity. In the midst of this scenario, documents, recordings, and declarations emerged whose authenticity could not be confirmed, but which added an additional layer of tension to the debate. The appearance of these materials, regardless of their origin, generated a new dynamic. The discussion ceased to focus solely on the main actors and opened toward broader issues regarding transparency, control mechanisms, and buried narratives that accompany certain business models. Each piece that emerged was interpreted differently by the two sectors of the audience. While some saw signs of a deeper framework, others pointed out the absence of verifications that would allow for the construction of a reliable timeline. Digital platforms also played a decisive role. The accelerated dissemination of content generated a constant feedback effect, where independent analyses, spontaneous comments, and critical reflections crossed paths simultaneously. This multiplicity of approaches caused the story to acquire new layers of meaning. A minor detail could transform into a crucial element simply by the way it was reinterpreted and shared. The demand for answers increased, but the complexity of the case prevented offering definitive explanations. Thus, the discussion began to transit from the figure of Xin Qi toward broader questionings regarding the structural functioning of the industry. At the same time, the memory of Yu Menglong's artistic trajectory rekindled debates about the difficulties faced by performers who depend on television selection systems or rigid contracts to start their careers. The tension between aspiration and reality returned to occupy a central place, as many observers pointed out that media exposure can become a double-edged sword. Visibility attracts opportunities, but it also increases pressure, deepens dependence on agencies, and reduces the margin of autonomy in crucial decisions. In Yu's case, the absence of verifiable information about his specific experience did not prevent his name from functioning as a catalyzing element within the broader debate. As reactions intensified, unexpected elements began to emerge that further expanded the radius of discussion. Some historical references, testimonies about situations that occurred in other contexts, and mentions linked to bodies of greater scope added a different dimension to the public conversation. These new fragments, far from providing clarity, contributed to the sensation that the story was connected to realms exceeding the entertainment industry. What initially began as a series of questions about contracts, corporate decisions, and personal dynamics drifted into a broader exploration of supervision mechanisms and episodes that had marked different communities in the past. The accumulation of these elements generated a turning point. The debate no longer revolved only around what had happened, but what might be hidden behind the constant flow of information. The audience, trapped between opposing versions, experienced a mixture of bewilderment and expectation that led many to question whether the emerging pieces were part of an isolated problem or if they revealed tensions that had remained hidden for years. That state of collective uncertainty paved the way for an even more unexpected turn when new documents began to circulate and extended the reach of the case toward spheres that no one had foreseen. As the public conversation advanced, collective perception experienced a profound change. What initially had arisen as a scattered set of testimonies and strategic silences began to acquire a graver tone. The story ceased to be a sequence of isolated interpretations and became a phenomenon generating unease, even among those who had maintained distance. The case entered a territory where the emotional load surpassed any attempt at immediate explanation, and where every detail seemed to add a new layer of complexity to a scenario already difficult to comprehend. At this point, the figure of Yu Menglong reappeared with a force that no one had foreseen. Some audio fragments and mentions resurfaced on social networks provoked an immediate impact, not for their isolated content, but for the way they resonated with the narrative that had developed until then. The public interpretation of those materials, even when they could not be conclusively verified, generated a feeling of restlessness that transcended the limits of the industry. For many observers, the situation began to represent something more than a labor conflict or a corporate dispute. It transformed into a reflection on the vulnerabilities of those who depend on structures that can prove difficult to question. The sensation of uncertainty reached its most intense point when mentions began to circulate regarding internal tensions, decisions made under unclear circumstances, and episodes that seemed to extend the story toward realms not previously contemplated. This stage marked what many described as the darkest moment of the case. The audience, immersed in a climate of confusion, perceived that the distance between what was known and what remained to be discovered was increasingly greater. Attempts to reconstruct the sequence of events met with voids impossible to fill, and the absence of official declarations added even more weight to that sensation of bewilderment. In the midst of this atmosphere, the discussion about the role of institutions acquired relevance. Various mentions linked to public bodies, administrative records, or professional practices appeared unexpectedly in the debate, generating questions about the way in which certain decisions could influence the development of particularly sensitive cases. The interpretation of these elements varied according to the focus of each sector of the public. Some observed an indication that the problems could exceed the strictly artistic realm, while others insisted on the need for caution, given the impossibility of contrasting the authenticity of the data that began to circulate. The most decisive turn occurred when a message attributed to an executive of an information body came to light, a document whose veracity could not be confirmed either, but which triggered an immediate reaction. The reference to warnings related to medical examinations or biological data generated a mixture of surprise and concern as it connected the case with a completely different dimension. This illusion introduced a new level of interpretation, in which the story seemed to transcend the personal sphere to situate itself in a broader framework regarding control mechanisms and the management of sensitive information. The international repercussion of this fragment further amplified the impact. Analysts from different countries began to refer to the case as an example of how partial information can trigger global debates on transparency, individual rights, and power structures. The discussion became more complex, as each new comment generated reflections on the relationship between corporate systems, public opinion, and institutional responsibility. This phenomenon evidenced how a case initially circumscribed to the entertainment sector could acquire connotations that vastly surpass that realm. In parallel, the industry faced practical consequences that highlighted the fragility of its internal functioning. Some projects were paused preventatively, not due to a direct relationship with the facts, but due to the perception that the general climate made it difficult to sustain a stable public narrative. This situation revealed that the reputation of those involved did not depend solely on their trajectory or their decisions, but also on the speed with which collective interpretations could mold social perception. As the case advanced, deeper analyses began to emerge, attempting to identify patterns in the succession of events. These studies did not seek to establish definitive conclusions, but to understand how certain elements could relate to one another within a broader framework of professional dynamics and strategic decisions. Some crisis management experts pointed out that the convergence between public silence, unverified documents, and unexpected mentions generated a perfect context for hypotheses to multiply. This phenomenon, far from clarifying the situation, increased the sensation that the story was expanding toward increasingly uncertain territories. At this point, the audience found itself before a scenario where narrative tension reached its climax. It was no longer a question of determining who had said what, nor of reconstructing a contract or a professional relationship. The story had evolved to become a reflection of collective concerns regarding power, transparency, and personal data protection. The convergence of these factors generated a provisional closure of great emotional intensity, in which the need for answers coexisted with the certainty that many pieces still could not be assembled. Many people began to wonder if these were just scattered pieces or signs of a larger system never before revealed. Upon concluding this extensive journey, the story reveals a scenario in which the public repercussion has far surpassed the initial limits of the case. The entertainment industry, accustomed to living with controversies and tensions typical of a highly competitive environment, was forced to face a debate that transcended the professional realm to install itself in global conversations about transparency, institutional responsibility, and personal data protection. Although many of the pieces remain without definitive verification, the emotional and structural impact generated by this episode continues to mold the internal discussions of the sector. The companies involved, aware of the effect that public perception can have on their sustainability, reviewed their internal procedures with an attention that had not been seen for years. Representation agencies began to reevaluate the way they managed the contracts of new talents, while some producers rethought communication strategies to anticipate potential reputational risks. This response did not arise from a direct relationship with proven facts, but from the recognition that, in an environment where narratives expand rapidly, prevention becomes an indispensable tool to sustain public trust. The case also incentivized a broader debate on the vulnerability of emerging artists, especially those who depend on rigid structures to start their careers. For many young performers, the story served as a reminder of the importance of thoroughly understanding the commitments they assume and seeking professional advice before accepting conditions that could limit their autonomy. The industry, for its part, was challenged to consider new forms of accompaniment that guarantee a healthier balance between professional promotion and personal well-being. The social dimension of the case left an equally significant mark. The circulation of documents, partial testimonies, and institutional references generated a framework in which the public began to reflect on the complex interaction between power, information, and perception. Even without definitive conclusions, the story exposed the need to strengthen media literacy and foster a culture of critical analysis, especially in a digital ecosystem where the speed of dissemination frequently exceeds the capacity for verification. The final message this episode leaves does not reside in identifying culprits or establishing categorical assertions, but in highlighting the importance of caution, transparency, and collective responsibility. The story shows that the fragility of public trust becomes a determining factor when informational voids widen and divergent narratives acquire a life of their own. It also reminds us that artists, executives, and institutions form part of an interdependent ecosystem where every decision has the potential to significantly influence social perception. Looking toward the future, it is likely that the case will continue to evolve as new elements emerge or as those implicated decide to offer clearer declarations. The industry, driven by the lessons learned, could advance toward more transparent management models and toward practices that strengthen the protection of those who depend on complex structures to develop their career. The audience, for its part, will continue to play a central role in the interpretation and dissemination of information, which makes individual responsibility an essential component of the public dialogue. The story leaves numerous questions open that, for now, can only be approached from reflection and prudence. Interpretations will continue to evolve, and conclusions can only be constructed over time, when distance allows for identifying with greater clarity which of the current elements are sustained by verifiable facts and which belong to the sphere of collective speculation. In such a dynamic scenario, understanding the mechanisms that configure social perception becomes as important as analyzing the facts themselves. To conclude, an invitation to continuous analysis remains open. What aspect of this story would you like us to explore in greater depth? Or what dimension of the entertainment sector interests you to understand in the next episode?